Everyone, thanks for coming. I'm thrilled to have the privilege of introducing Mike, who's here visiting Princeton this fall. He was the founding director of the CHIPS program and probably knows more about industrial policy and practice than pretty much anyone here. He's done a lot of interesting things. He helped implement the child tax credit expansion in the Biden administration. He at the state level, was the commissioner for tax policy, or the official title, commissioner of the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance, managed $100 billion of revenue, and did a lot of work at the state policy level. We knew each other from the Obama administration when he was at the Treasury. What his life, he was one of the two Mikes, along with Mike Shapiro, helping the Clinton campaign. Advised on economic policy, and he spent a lot of time in New Haven, both as an undergrad and at law school, and so I'm happy he made the upgrade to be here. So I'll turn it over to Mike.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Zadar. It is wonderful to be here. I have a presentation, hopefully about 30, 45 minutes. We'll see how long it takes. But honestly, feel free to, if you have questions, just jump in. I want this to be interesting and engaging and happy to take it wherever. I spent almost 2.5 years running the CHIPS office. I'm still in recovery from that experience. I thank Princeton for facilitating that transition back into regular life. But it was a fully immersive, engaging, dynamic experience. It was government execution in its kind of most rawest and most interesting form, as well as exploring new ways of government intersecting and relating to the private sector. And we were all kind of doing it from scratch with no playbook. And so an exercise like this is actually it's great for me too, because it forces me to think back and really reflect on what we learned and what does that mean going forward. So hopefully there'll be some insights that you find helpful and interesting as well. I'm going to do a little, because I know this is not a CHIPS focus. By the way, I came into the CHIPS Act without any experience in semiconductors either. So if you have any basic questions, I've learned a little bit over the course of the last few years. But I will do a basic laydown of the semiconductor industry and the CHIPS Act. I'll do some storytelling just on the story of implementation, so that we're all kind of operating, have a sense for what we went through and getting it done. We'll talk about the results, and then I'll try to tie that storytelling together with a few lessons learned for industrial policy efforts going forward. My view is that whether you like it or not, industrial policy is here to stay, and whether that's from an energy and climate perspective, whether that's from a national security perspective, our economy and our national security interests have evolved in such a way that there is bipartisan interest in industrial policy, and it will only grow, and I think mostly for good reason. The question is, are we doing it right? And I think industrial policy is, I've heard it said industrial policy is like cholesterol. There's a good kind and a bad kind. And so hopefully we can do more of the good kind. And I think these types of discussions are important for teasing that out. Okay, chips. Chips are everywhere. Anything with an on-off switch, ubiquitous in the global economy. 75% of the global economy relies on chips. I mean, think about that. That is a massive number. It is particularly at the leading edge, the most advanced chips. It is the most complicated manufacturing process in the world. So I had the privilege of getting to tour TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. They're the big Taiwanese company that dominates global supply chains. I toured their facilities both in Arizona and in Taiwan. When you are walking through these factories, you are truly struck that you are at the height of human capacity. A single factory is 11 football fields large, more steel than twice an Empire State Building, just for one, and now costs $25 billion. Most of that is for just incredibly complicated, sophisticated equipment. And it's integrated into the most complex, efficient supply chain in the entire world. And so, but it is not a monolith, and that's important. I think that was important for the CHIPS Act. So the industry is broken down into segments. What you read most about in the news, to the extent you'll read about NVIDIA and AI, those are leading edge logic chips. Those are processing chips that are driving AI, supercomputing. That's the current boom in leading edge logic chips is AI and supercomputing. The last boom was smartphones, right? And actually the reason TSMC is so dominant and the reason Intel fell behind is that TSMC got the iPhone. And it totally took off on the smartphone train, and Intel was left making chips for computers and servers, and that wasn't the future. And now Intel is struggling even further because they haven't gotten on the AI wave. NVIDIA, the company you hear about, NVIDIA doesn't manufacture chips. They are a fabless, meaning they don't have a fab. A fab is a fabrication facility. It's a manufacturing facility. They are a fabless semiconductor company. They manufacture their chips through TSMC, that company in Taiwan, okay? TSMC is at the leading edge, really two competitors. And by competitors, I mean companies that can claim to try to compete. And those are Samsung and Intel, okay? So this is at leading edge logic. Leading edge memory, again, only 3 companies in the world. Micron, Samsung, and SK Hynix can do leading edge memory chips. Leading edge memory is also critical for basically most of the same applications as leading edge logic. So, NVIDIA GPU will have the NVIDIA processor, but then they'll use an SK Hynix memory chip or a Micron memory chip, hopefully soon a Samsung memory chip for similar end uses. That is like most of what drives headlines in the industry. It is what is driving the extraordinary profits in the industry. So like NVIDIA is a $4 trillion company. I mean, that's like a mind-boggling. TSMC is a $1.2 trillion company. Pretty good. But it is a broad industry, and most chips in the world, the vast majority of chips made in the world, are actually what are called legacy chips. They go into things like automobiles, medical devices, military systems, these light bulbs, basic, Internet of Things. The whole world is running on legacy chips. Leading edge the logic chips, memory chips, legacy chips. That's all called the front end, the manufacturing of the chip itself. Downstream of that, you have to package the chip before it ends up in electronics. That's a really important part of the supply chain. There are broadly speaking, two categories of packaging. One is advanced packaging, which is more automated, more sophisticated, more technologically advanced. As it becomes harder and harder to make chips work better, packaging them in creative ways becomes really, really important for enhancing performance and energy efficiency. And then there's conventional packaging, which is, think of it more people kind of attaching wires to chips and again, for less kind of high-end uses. And then upstream, as I said, there's of the fabrication facilities, there's a massive and like totally complicated and intricate semiconductor supply chain of both materials and equipment. The most famous equipment that people talk about is the ASML lithography machine. That's a Dutch company that makes EUV lithography tools that basically shoot light in crazy dynamic ways to make the patterns on chips that are so tiny. I mean, a single NVIDIA GPU has billions of transistors. So again, these are like the biggest, most expensive facilities in the world, making the tiniest things humans can make, which are these little transistors on chips. Why the CHIPS Act? U.S. used to be a major leader in semiconductor manufacturing. Production declined from 40% to around 10%. Importantly, at the leading edge, so on the logic at the leading edge, declined to 0. So the number is 0. That's not like, roughly, it's 0. Until TSMC started producing chips at their Arizona facility at the beginning of this year, that number was 0. And at that leading edge logic, that is almost entirely in Taiwan in TSMC's facilities. So if you think about the geopolitical backdrop for the CHIPS Act, the reliance on Taiwan for leading edge logic chips is foundational. Leading edge memory chips also had declined to 0, which is 100% reliant on East Asia. That is more broadly diversified between Korea and Taiwan. And then packaging, near 0, 0 advanced packaging. Overall, the packaging supply chain had mostly atrophied to 0, and then corresponding atrophy of the upstream supply chain. That's not to say the United States didn't have some real strengths, and we harness those strengths. So those fabless companies, the companies that buy chips, NVIDIA, AMD, Qualcomm, Apple, Alphabet, Meta, all that is a huge strength. And there are American equipment companies, not ASML, but they're mostly doing their manufacturing overseas now. So the CHIPS Act had $50 billion for the Commerce Department. $39 billion was for grants to incentivize manufacturing. That's the part that I manage at the Commerce Department, so that's what we'll talk about today. Importantly, there's also $11 billion for R&D, and there's about $2 billion that was at the Defense Department, State Department, and the National Science Foundation. And then critically, doesn't get as much attention, but there's a 25% investment tax credit for semiconductor manufacturing coming out of the Treasury Department. Usually the grants that we made were about 10% of CapEx. So when you actually think about the capital stack of a fab, the ITC was even more important. We were kind of a topper to make it happen, yes. Yeah.
The chip manufacturing market shares, the 40 to 10%, and one that went to the memory chips that went to 0%. Do you have that corresponding number if you add memory chips, logic chips, as well as the chip design, NVIDIA, and all the chip adjacent stuff, Broadcom, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, all of that? What would be the U.S. market share if you look at that? Basically, the chip industry as a whole.
Well, in the manufacturing, it's around 10%. In terms of where the chips are manufactured. In terms of the... Right. So, yeah. And that's massive, and that's $4 trillion, and that's an American company. But they are doing all their manufacturing in Taiwan. That would be a high market share. I mean, at the leading edge, if you're looking at the fabless market share that's quite high, the question becomes where are they doing their manufacturing?
That's what I'm trying to say. What if we pitched it like this? I think from a U.S.-centered perspective, maybe if we looked at that number, it's been an amazing success story for the U.S. over the last few decades. They outsourced the manufacturing, focused on design, using the smartest people. They, created companies that, despite all of TSMC's success, NVIDIA has been more successful in terms of numbers.
I think that's a very compelling story, actually, in the sense that there's a narrative that says the U.S. over the last 3 decades, whatever, totally messed up its economic model, right? How do we let all this manufacturing go? And my view is it's more complicated than that, because you can't disentangle the rise of NVIDIA from the rise of TSMC. Those two things kind of happen together, right? And so then the question is, okay, in the context of that evolution, certain national security vulnerabilities have emerged that have to do with reliance, particularly on Taiwan, but East Asia more broadly. So the question is, how can we use our policy tools to address that? And it kind of gets back to my point about the cholesterol. Because there are versions of industrial policy where you say, you need to harness the amazing strengths of the American system, in my view, and while kind of in a targeted way addressing some of the vulnerabilities that have emerged. So, yes.
I'm going to ask a really basic question because I learned about what chips are several times, but I still get confused. Is it just like a really tiny conductor for electricity? What makes them so?
So they are, chips are usually little pieces of silicon, and they have tiny microscopic transistors that are basically like on-off switches, and they can be used for anything. So some of it can be as simple as turning a light switch on and off, and some of it can be basically translating electric currents into zeros and ones billions and billions of times to inform computation in the context of a smartphone or AI. So the story, you kind of think of it in a few phases. The first phase was the startup phase, and this is people often don't think of government operations in this context, but I was in September of 2022, so the bill passed in August of 2022. I was hired in September as the first employee, and you show up and there's nothing, right? And you have this really important mission, but you don't have any infrastructure to really support it. Now, Secretary Raimondo at the Commerce Department, to her credit, had a kind of very small team of people thinking, what if this passes? And she had actually said to the bureaus within the Commerce Department, I need 2 of your best people from all of you assigned to the team. So when I showed up, there was like a team of short-term details. But it was, so I didn't literally have nothing. But none of those people actually ended up on the CHIPS team. They all were there to kind of help with the startup, and then we had to build the team from scratch. We, this startup phase, I think of it in kind of 3 buckets. The first is building the team. And we ended up building a team of 180 people with backgrounds in the semiconductor industry, private equity, banking, consulting, the national security agencies, workforce experts, environmental review and permitting, a very broad, diverse group. Really importantly, building the team was a cabinet level priority. So every time I went to brief Secretary Raimondo, the briefing always started with where are we on the team? Where are we on recruiting? She would personally get involved in calling people, recruiting them, hiring. When I went to the White House, meeting with the National Economic Advisor, National Security Advisor, I would go with asks. I would say, Jake, can you call so-and-so? I know you're friends with them, and convince them to come work for me. And he would do it, right? It would be that level of commitment to building the team because we knew that was foundational. The second bullet is interesting. We put out something called a vision for success. We had this big mandate, which was onshoring semiconductor manufacturing. But beyond that, there was no direction in the statute or otherwise saying where we should be making our investments, what we should be trying to achieve. And we took the view that instead of making a bunch of investments and kind of telling a story from there, which I called kind of putting the stars in the sky and then drawing the constellation, we should do our best to draw a rough constellation of what we wanted to try to achieve, try to attract applications that could fulfill those goals, and then execute deals to advance those objectives. So, and that was a ton of work that went into a document we called our Vision for Success. It didn't get a ton of attention, but it was hugely important as a signal to industry of what we thought success would look like. It shaped applications. And hugely important, frankly, as an anchor for our team internally. So anytime we met to assess an opportunity, an application, we had an investment committee structure that we set up. It was always anchored on our vision for success. That was always kind of our North Star. And we went through all those industry categories and tried to add some measure of specificity of what we were trying to achieve. Importantly, on leading edge logic, we said we wanted to create at least 2 clusters. So there were 3 companies that were kind of vying for the space in leading edge logic. We said we want at least 2 of them to be successful in the United States. So you did the team, you have the vision, but then you need the nuts and bolts of a program. And that for us was in what's called a Notice of Funding Opportunity. That's basically the bureaucratic document they have to put out that says, this is how this is going to work. This is what the application is going to look like. This is what the process looks like. This is how we're going to evaluate applications. This is how we're going to negotiate them. These are going to be the parameters for the ultimate funding disbursements. The really important decision we made in the Notice of Funding Opportunity was to create a dynamic and flexible evaluation process. So typically in government, there's a lot of, the typical way to do things is to, get an application for a grant in, and you have independent scoring of that application against some predetermined criteria. And then, kind of black box, it emerges, and so-and-so is going to get money. And we just knew instinctively that's not going to work here, right? We need to set a set of clear objectives, and then we need something that is going to be holistic and dynamic in helping us achieve those objectives. And so that's what we did, and we were very clear in how we structured the NOFO that our priority would be advancing economic and national security by onshoring semiconductor manufacturing. We create a process to have very iterative and dynamic commercial negotiations. So it wasn't just an application and an offer. It was back and forth with the applicants the whole time, happening simultaneously across the full industry. And then we received some significant criticism when we put it out. There's a phrase, everything bagel liberalism, which was Ezra Klein coined, actually about the CHIPS op-ed, which was nice. And then from the right, there was criticism on provisions related to DEI, and so I'll come back to that in terms of lessons there. Okay, so we're yes.
A question about sort of the vision for success. When it came down to the logic clusters, on a more technical note, what were you sort of looking for like a successful logic cluster in terms of process manufacturing and whatnot?
A couple things. One was obviously as close to the leading edge as possible, and now that is tough particularly when you're talking about companies with their headquarters in Taiwan or Korea, because their R&D is overseas. And so the question is, how close can you be to the leading edge? Meaning, like, is this literally the most advanced chip in the world? Is it 6 months behind the most advanced chip in the world? Is it 18 months behind? That kind of thing. Then it was really about the ecosystem that we were trying to create around it. So workforce, supply chain, R&D, co-locating R&D was a really important focus of ours. Basically, all the indicators for whether the cluster was going to be able to be self-sustaining going forward. We viewed the CHIPS Act grant. We didn't know if there was going to be a CHIPS 2, right? People kind of talked about it. We didn't want to take that for granted. It was all about how you can create self-sustaining dynamics, and that was about creating these regional ecosystems where it would be more attractive to invest going forward, right? When TSMC decided to build Fab 1 in Arizona, there was nothing there, right? Arizona had some ecosystem. Intel was there. There were some other companies. Interesting, though, like Intel was in Chandler. TSMC was in Phoenix. Those are right next to each other, but they're totally different municipalities, so the muscle strength of the local governments were totally different in terms of permitting the local fabs. But it was really about creating those self-sustaining dynamics so that next round of investment would be easier for companies to make.
So you're able to set your own kind of valuation metrics. Does Treasury, like Treasury has to do for tax credits, you guys at Commerce have to issue like kind of formalized guidance on which projects would be eligible for grant funding and be evaluated, or is it more of an informal process?
No, it was all spelled out in formal guidance, which is this notice of funding opportunity. The notice of funding opportunity might be it was probably an 80-page document. It was like a dense, legalistic, but it was in the construct of that notice of funding opportunity that we were going to make decisions holistically, and kind of where we would set up a process and governance that we would be able to do so in a way that advanced the interests of the program, the goals of the program.
Was there any blowback from the bipartisan lawmakers who don't put the bill through?
No, in the sense that, there was blowback on plenty of stuff, but the really important thing was always this, prioritizing economic and national security, right? So that was the purpose of the bill. That was the bipartisan purpose of the bill. And we were always able to make clear that we were going to focus on that North Star, and that even if if we're getting criticism we were going to stray from it, we're focused on other things, we were always focused on that, and we were consistent about that. Yes?
can you say something more specific? You know, I'm wondering how this this process really worked in practice. So what did the US government have to do exactly to convince Taiwan Semiconductors to use an Arizona, which is not something that they inherently wanted to do? How much was carrot? How much was stick? Were they getting money? Were there threats? How did it work?
So, I mean, it's a great question. I'll get into that. I'll do a little TSMC. I'll figure out how much TSMC I'll do. But this is phase two. So this is where we kind of put the notice of funding opportunity out, and it's out in the wild, and we actually don't know what to expect, right? It's like we don't know, are we going to get big applications, little applications, a lot of interest, not a lot of interest. You're kind of operating in this fog of uncertainty. We received a lot of criticism that the application was too burdensome. We were asking for too much information. We were considering too many different things. There's criticism about a child care provision, and so you're hearing all that, and you're really wondering, what are we going to get in? We ended up getting in huge requests on our money. So remember, we had $39 billion. TSMC, Samsung, Micron, and Intel, just those four companies asked for more than $70 billion. So at that point, we kind of know. It's like, all right, we're in one here. This is going to be a fun ride, because we then have to enter into a set of very difficult, challenging, simultaneous negotiations with industry to land deals that ultimately comport with our vision for success. Remember, the vision for success is not just leading edge; it's also advanced packaging, current mature, et cetera. And so we're trying to fit it within that portfolio framework. It's like pieces of a puzzle that need to land, but if any one of them doesn't land appropriately, the whole thing kind of could fall apart, right? And so that was, now what did that look like? It depended on the company, right? So for some companies, they might come in with a huge amount of ambition and asking for a huge amount of money, and it's an exercise of saying, we like the ambition, but we're not going to be able to give you that level of subsidy. And so you're kind of trying to find a landing zone that will work for them. We're doing top-down portfolio analysis. We're also doing bottom-up economic analysis. So we have a team of financial analysts, coming from private equity banking, that are doing bottom-up assessment of the returns on a project level, receiving models from the companies. So we're able to say to them, we think you can make it work with X, not Y. So that's the dynamic there. Or in other instances, we might want more, right? And more could be TSMC. We'd really love to see a third fab, right? TSMC, they had announced one fab before CHIPS was passed. When CHIPS was passed, they announced a second. As part of our negotiations, they announced a third fab. Or that could be, those negotiations were also got to as specific as we'd really love, there's a particular technology that we know the Defense Department uses, but you only produce it in Singapore. We would love you to onshore that technology, and we'll tie a milestone of funding specifically to the onshoring of that technology. Or we'd really love, you're an international company, we'd really love for you to change the governance of your U.S. entity so that you can do classified work with the Department of Defense. So we were in those discussions, as well as the macro discussions of funding amount and project scope. Importantly, as we're doing these negotiations, we also were engaging extensively with the broader industry, right? So we tried to create a hub within the CHIPS team that was interacting not only with the manufacturers, but with their customers. And so we had active dialogues with Apple, NVIDIA, AMD, Qualcomm, both because we wanted to encourage those companies to create demand signals for US chips. We only had supply side incentives. We didn't have demand side incentives. I think that's very important in terms of, the tools we had and we didn't to create success, but also so that we had information, right? Because one of the challenges operating in government with the private sector is information asymmetry. And we, both by having expertise on our team that could kind of go toe-to-toe with the private sector, but also by developing independent relationships with their customers, we ended up having, I think, a very clear picture of the overall industry as a whole. One unfortunate development during all of this, in the middle of these negotiations, a bill passed in Congress as part of a government funding bill that took a slice of CHIPS funding and dedicated it to a specialized defense project. And that might not, it wasn't a huge amount of money in the grand scheme. It was like $3.5 billion. So you might say, oh, you have 39, that's not a big deal. But remember, we were creating that portfolio construct. And we were in the middle of these negotiations in the context of that portfolio construct. And so we actually had to go to companies and renegotiate. It was, and those, of all the tough conversations and kind of unpleasant experiences of this, that period was really hard because we're trying to, yes. Usually the basic contours of a negotiation are about the projects, so like how many fabs you're going to build, the scope of those projects, the size of those projects, against the incentive. And that, once you set that up, then we would negotiate some more specifics around things like specific technologies, but usually that's the basic contour of the negotiation. Another really big one is that money would go out over time in milestones. So we're tying funds, so it's like you finish a clean room. That's one milestone, you get some portion of it. You finish your tool installations, you enter commercial production. Money goes out over time. That, because we had a fixed pot of money, that became a very natural place to negotiate, where we wanted to make sure that we were protecting funds going out over time. The companies wanted to recognize present value, and so pull as much of it as forward as possible. And so that was another very active, yes.
As this is going on, previously, how much continuity did you have with the legislative team that passed the bill, and then your team that had to act?
So we had a fair amount of continuity, and I'll get to this in the lessons learned. The Commerce Department staff had been instrumental in passing the bill, so there was a lot of institutional memory baked into that. And then a lot of relationships with the Hill. I personally spent a fair amount of time on the Hill talking to the major champions of the CHIPS Act to explain what we were trying to do from a big picture perspective. So Mark Warner or Senator Young, Senator Cornyn, Congressman McCall, we call them like the CHIPS champions, Doris Matsui. So there was a fair amount of dialogue with a core of folks in Congress who believed in the bill and understood what we were trying to achieve. And then, of course, committees and appropriators, et cetera. Okay, so we land the deals in this wave of term sheets that all get announced in the spring of 2024. And it's like this big exhale, we're going to do it, great. And then we entered what I remember fondly as the grind. So the way our process was structured is we'd land preliminary term sheets, you'd sign a preliminary term sheet, and then you would, and then once that's signed, you do a period of due diligence, and then you turn that term sheet, which might be 20 pages, into a full legal document, fully binding contract, which might be a few hundred pages. So, so we entered this period of doing due diligence and negotiating these preliminary term sheets into final award documentation. And a couple things happened. One is this is a very dynamic industry, and it continues to shift. And some of our applicants went through some very challenging quarterly results, changing investment plans. So we have to renegotiate some of the deals, some of the milestones. But then also, in a way that I didn't anticipate ex ante, actually getting to final terms was incredibly challenging. And it was, we worked with our lawyers. We had an incredible legal team to put together documents that we thought, were kind of consistent with, kind of drawing on parallels for how the government has done this kind of thing in the past. And we sent them over, and it was just, it just didn't meet the market, right? It was, corporate board saying these projects are tens of billions of dollars, and there's just way too much uncertainty embedded in these legal documents for us to rely on this incentive. And so then I spent suddenly, hundreds of hours mired in the details of like covenants and conditions precedent and reps and warranties and events of default, and just like trying to find a landing zone so that we could get these deals done. And ultimately we did. We also, throughout the program, but really in this period, we were encountering obstacles. Overwhelmingly, the CHIPS Act, I think one reason for its success is the CHIPS Act had a lot of discretion for the implementing agency, right, to balance interests, get things done. Where we had the biggest problems were where that wasn't the case. So NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, that ends up being challenging because there's environmental review. That actually is not the problem. It's that a judge is empowered to say that the environmental review isn't good enough, and they can halt the funding for a particular project, and that can be hugely disruptive. Davis-Bacon, that's a prevailing wage for construction workers. The challenge wasn't in the prevailing wage; it was in the administrative implementation of Davis-Bacon, and that was in the power of the Commerce Department. Of the Labor Department, which we didn't control, and so we ran into some real challenges there. There were national security guardrails in the statute, so you can't, if you take our money, you can't expand in China, that kind of thing. A lot of business interests there, and then I talked to the legal terms. But we got through all of that. We ended up getting 20 deals done, $34 billion allocated. I remember it was like August or something, and we hadn't gotten any deals finalized in 2020. And I'm thinking to myself, how are we going to get this done? And the chief investment officer on the CHIPS was a guy named Todd Fisher. Todd had spent 25 years at KKR, which is a major private equity firm. And we were briefing the secretary. At this point, she was asking for like weekly, deal by deal, where are we kind of thing. And we're walking out of our office. I said, Todd, between now and the end of the year, how many deals do you think KKR is going to get done? Like big deals. He said, like 2 or 3. And I said, we're supposed to do 15. But we actually did. And it was just like kind of through relentless work. Yes?
This was to be sure your level goal was it to bring back the task production back to the U.S. or to be sure some supply chain and manufacturing such that when there's some future shock, the U.S. could wrap up the production.
It's a really great question. Closer to the latter than the former. The entire supply chain, it is so vast, so sophisticated that you couldn't do it, and it wouldn't even be the right goal in the first place, right? This is the most complex, intricate supply chain in the world. It was about reshoring baseline level production, particularly in areas that we thought were strategically important, and then trying to build as much of a supply chain and ecosystem around that as possible within that context and within our constraints.
In the political, people studying political economy, a question was, would industrial policy lead to support for, in this case, the Democrats, because they were the party in charge of CHIPS. And I feel like there was a certain amount of glee among the industrial policy opponents that very preliminary analysis, just like where did the deals get done, what was the change in the vote for Democrat between 24 and 20, and there was like no real relationship. My instinct whenever I saw that was like, there was actually no jobs yet. But I've had trouble like getting a sense of like, would the average voter in an area that got a contract even know about it by November 2024? Because I think the politics of this is actually important to see whether it's sustainable politically.
It's a really good question. I think, well, in the first instance, the geography is in terms of how we made decisions, and then I'll kind of reflect on your question. Geography was not really part of our decision making in the sense that it was the companies that decided where they want to invest, and they were
Given where places were, there's been additional analysis
saying that there was no.
there's no benefit for Biden or, actually
My
And I'm just asking, is that even a fair test, just given this context?
look, you could say, yeah, there weren't jobs yet. There wasn't, and I think there's some of that's true. There were a lot of construction jobs, though. A lot of construction jobs. I mean, if you go to any of these sites, there was a city of people, 10,000 people coming in and out to build the fabs every day. I mean, just to build the roads and the infrastructure to get the construction workers there was a big project. So construction jobs huge. Some of them producing manufacturing jobs, but not at scale. But even then, relative to the size of these economies, TSMC will employ, 6,000 manufacturing workers as they ramp up through Fab 3. So that's significant, but obviously Arizona is a meaningfully sized state, so yes.
I was interested to know, was there any debate as CHIPS was coming along, as you were approaching companies, as to whether you should approach things from the perspective of onshoring or maybe friendshoring? Because I know there's the idea of like, okay, maybe a fully globalized economy where we have to depend in part on China, and maybe sometimes our relationship with them is adversarial, maybe that won't work. But what about shrinking the idea of how large the global economy is and just, shoring up manufacturing in friendly economies, maybe in Europe?
Yeah, so absolutely. And in my view, those discussions were, they were kind of complementary, which is to say, if you believe in more of a friendshoring vision, the United States is 25% of the global economy. Like, we have a role to play in that. And particularly at the leading edge, there aren't actually that many countries in the world that can credibly lay claim to the ability to create manufacturing ecosystems. Given how complicated, how expensive, the supply chain, all of that, the importance of rule of law, stability for an investment that expensive, we were competing against Taiwan, Korea, Japan, Singapore, China's its kind of its own thing. A few others that kind of Europe, but it wasn't like it's not like if you're a leading edge manufacturer, you're not looking around the whole world and saying maybe there are some kind of constraints on it. But within that context, then I think what you ended up seeing was a pretty. And on my team, we developed an international engagement team, so we were in regular dialogue with our counterparts in Europe and in Japan and Korea and India and Taiwan, et cetera. And I think you saw evolving almost kind of organically, like a pretty natural allocation of the supply chain. So like, we have really strong leading edge customers, so it makes sense that companies would want to build leading edge here. Japan and Europe made the most progress on it for industrial customers, building more lagging edge chips, which I think makes a lot of sense given the nature of those economies. So, yeah.
I'm wondering how important the ability to assert national security interests was here in sort of blowing away bureaucratic obstacles. Like if the broadband people could have said that, would we be having a success story presentation from the broadband team? Surely there's no success story for the broadband.
So I think it was important, but only to an extent, right? It was important in that it informed how we designed the program. So what was in our discretion, we made clear we were always going to be making decisions in a way that prioritized national security. It was certainly important in terms of the kind of nature of the stakeholders in the government who are interested in seeing the program be successful. And then from a legal standpoint, it was less helpful. And that's because things like environmental statutes, permitting statutes, people would, we'd be struggling through these things, and people, eventually someone will always say, well, there's got to be a national security exemption, right? And then you talk to a lawyer, and it's like, well, no, there's not, or well, there's this one thing, but it's really for this other context, and so let's look into it, and we'll spend a month tussling with a White House counsel lawyer, and then the EPA lawyers will get involved, and then it's like the outcome will always be like, well, sure, maybe you could do that, but our assessment is you'll get sued and lose. And then you say, well, okay, well, I guess maybe I shouldn't do that, So I actually found that from a legal standpoint, the national security justification didn't give a ton of added flexibility. Yeah.
Thinking about the bigger picture here, so where do you see the U.S. government going with this? So, as as an economist, it's hard not to be extremely skeptical on what's going on here, right? So the U.S. government picks a particular industry at a particular point in time where a particular set of firms are dominant, and they subsidize those. Why AI? Why chips? Why not the internet in the 90s? What about the next big thing in the 2030s or the 2040s when TSMC is no longer a big company? So we're sort of forgetting the old lessons about the market as an efficient transmitter of information and a provider of incentives, right? So is the U.S. government now going to try and pick the winners, pick the technologies on a more ongoing basis and make these deals with specific companies?
I think, well, that's a big question. I think it gets back
I'm not saying, industrial policy is not only here, that's the way things are going.
No, it is. And my personal belief is that's the way things are going. I think it's going that way for a reason, mostly because we're engaged in competition with China, and this is very much how China does business. And if you look at the gains that China has made in a range of technology-driven manufacturing industries over the last decade, it is truly extraordinary. And I think if you project that out in the context of geopolitical competition going forward, that is something we have to take very seriously from a national security standpoint. That does not mean, however, that China's model of industrial policy should be ours. I mean, China's model of industrial policy is to identify a strategic industry. All the provincial governments then support their competitor in that industry. Those companies then engage in ruthless, cutthroat, capitalist competition against each other. And what emerges out of that is an extraordinarily competitive global competitor. And that's the story of a company like BYD, Solar, et cetera. That's how. Now, I just don't think that works. That is not, in my view, consistent with our economic model or our political system. So the question then becomes, what is a version of U.S. industrial policy that can be sustainable going forward? And I think it starts with this question, which you're raising, of how do you identify the industries in the first place? And I actually, right now, I believe we're kind of operating with a bit of like a, you know when you see it kind of thing, and it's really driven by intuitions, conversations bubbling up on the hill about this industry or that industry. So I think one important piece of business is like actually creating a theoretical framework. I think you can do it. I've spent some time thinking about it. I think it has to do with some measure of the criticality of an industry for national security uses or dual use situations. I think it has to do with the geographic footprint of the industry and how reliant in particular we are on China. And I think it has to do with some expectation of how things are going to evolve over time, right? What's going to be important in the future. But I don't think it's easy. But I don't know that we have a choice, and I think the question is, can we figure out how to do it well?
Yes. So there was a recent announcement that the U.S. would take a 10% equity ownership of Intel, right?
Yeah.
So is this a continuation of this CHIPS Act, or this is a change?
Yeah, so Intel, why don't I'll talk about Intel, and then I'll quickly go through the remaining slides, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for questions. So yeah, so Intel, what they did is we had, while I was there, we signed a deal with Intel to support manufacturing across Arizona, Ohio, Oregon, and New Mexico. And the money would go out over time against milestones. And basically what happened with the Intel deal is instead of having the money go out over time against milestones, they just sent Intel the money and they took shares. And so the question becomes, how do you think about that in the context of what we're trying to achieve?
Sorry, they mean Trump using this.
They meaning the government, yes.
Under Trump.
Under Trump.
Sorry,
Yeah. This all happened like in the last couple of weeks.
You were describing that.
Yeah. That's what happened. So it's like you take a deal, the money's kind of there, but it's going to go out over time if they meet the milestones. You get rid of those milestones, you give them the money, and the government gets 10%. So the question is why? Like what are you trying to achieve by doing that? Intel's challenge is that they don't have customers, right? They're trying to establish a foundry business. They need a big customer like an NVIDIA or an Apple or an AMD to manufacture at scale with Intel. Taking ownership doesn't do anything immediately to address that problem. And if anything, it makes Intel less cost competitive, because the whole point of chips is to make companies more cost competitive against manufacturing overseas. Or now Intel's competitors are receiving grants from the US government, right? So their grants now have the cost of equity, so they're not grants. And their competitors have a different cost structure without any, at least, direct link to the customer problem. I think the stated goal is to make money, right? The US government suddenly has come across a very large equity stake in Intel. And I just don't believe that should be the primary purpose of industrial policy. I think you can design, we have upside sharing in our grants, so like if profits are way higher than expected, the taxpayer would receive. So I think you can design taxpayer protections. I think there might be circumstances where an equity stake makes some sense, but it's all about, all of the tools of industrial policy have a cost, they have downsides, whether it's fiscal costs to the government or distortions and kind of policy complexity and distortion. And I think in this instance, it's hard to see what, I think we've introduced a lot of policy risk and downside, and I'm not sure what we're achieving with the tool of equity. Yeah.
So I know that CHIPS was mostly through commerce and not the DoD, but what is the role of DoD? My sense is that there's no bigger budget than the defense budget, and that it's very, Department of War. At least is probably more accurate. And so was there a role, again, maybe separate from CHIPS, where they were the final, the DoD will buy your product and sort of demand signals?
Yeah, so it's interesting you say that. Like DoD, so DoD had a role in CHIPS. There was some money that went to DoD. We tried to talk to them so that if we were evaluating an application, we knew technologies might be helpful, supportive to them. If you look back, like the old days of the chip industry, DoD had a huge role, and it was on the demand side, right? And the struggle with chip, and by the way, the MP Materials deal, the critical minerals deal that they just did, that's on the demand side. Like the big subsidy in that deal is that they're providing guaranteed offtake and a price floor, which by the way is a huge subsidy, and it's unclear to me if it is a kind of appropriately calibrated subsidy, but it is within the balance sheet of DoD to be able to do that given the size of that market. The challenge with chips is you can't rely on the 5 minutes, okay. Okay, I'm gonna do my thing. But you can't really rely on DoD demand signals because DoD might be 1% or 2% of fab offtake. So it's really, it's just a different construct. And that again gets to this question of like, what does the market look like? What are the tools of industrial policy and how do you use them? So, okay, so results, the most important result for me was always that we got it done. When you're running the program, I've just felt every day this enormous weight of, are we gonna actually, execute the program? We ended up signing 20 final award agreements for $34 billion. After we signed those, $4 billion actually went out the door in cash based on milestones that had been met. I talked about those 5 companies that are able to manufacture leading edge chips. They're all making major investments in the United States. There's no other company in the world, country in the world that has more than 2 of those companies operating on its shores. And we've seen more investment in electronics manufacturing over the last 4 years than the previous 3 decades combined. So it actually is a kind of hockey stick effect that obviously we want to see sustained going forward. Planned investments now of more than $500 billion. These are more details in terms of the footprint that is being built out. TSMC's investment is the largest foreign direct investment in the history of the country. Samsung's is the second. So the scale of what we're doing here, it is unprecedented for the country. And with the exception of Intel, you've actually seen a reasonable amount of continuity, particularly compared to other Biden-era programs. Okay, so lessons learned, I'll do it very quickly. One is establish clear goals and effectively prioritize them. I talked about the vision for success, and then on the flip side, the challenges of when you have frameworks that are orthogonal to those goals that make it harder to execute those goals. So I think that flexibility, not only to set the goals, but then to prioritize them in implementation is hugely, hugely important. I talked about building and retaining an extraordinary team. That required cabinet level focus. But we also, there were also still challenges even within, we also had special hiring authorities, which were very important, but we also ran into constraints that are natural in operating in government. I think a really important area of focus going forward is government human resources systems and how we can make them more efficient. And I didn't talk about contracting, but contracting is broken. Federal contracting is a total mess and really held us back meaningfully. 2 is risk. Didn't talk a lot about this, but people would always talk about Solyndra, and I'd say, what Solyndra is? This old. I would say we're not talking about Solyndra anymore. It's banned. We're gonna have a rule. But it's really about recognizing that the government is there to take some risk, and there's both process risk and oversight risk. You have to be willing to embrace a little bit of that, and also, the substance of it. And for us, we created a diversified portfolio of investments. We established a quarterly risk committee. We met quarterly to look at the risk of the office of the portfolio. I think it was, we kind of created governance to assess risk. New models for government interaction with business. I talked about the, engaging with the broader ecosystem, chip customers. I will say this is a really interesting thing to watch now because the current administration's model for interacting with business is very different. And I think that version of what it looks like for the government to interact with the state in the context of these strategic national security and other interests is very important. Focus on operational excellence. This sounds a little, might sound boring, but in government, there's a lot of focus on policy, and elevating operations to kind of sit alongside policy is hugely important. It also is hugely important for retention of that great team, because if there's one thing that drives people crazy is when they work for an organization that doesn't function well, and you can't pay people well, you're just there convincing them that the mission is good, and so focus on operations and process is really important. And then last was maintenance of bipartisan support. And we spent, as I said, a lot of time engaged on the Hill. Being apolitical does not mean ignoring politics, I like to say. You can't pretend you rise above it. You have to constantly be explaining to key stakeholders the decisions you're making and why you're making those decisions. So that's it, just in time.
Before we start taking questions, just a reminder that Mike will be here back November 6th. Case and I was collecting for answer questions, and I was check. The police out in yeah. I'm going to go back to the supply chain question. You didn't talk very much about branded homes for our fans. It's one of the probably the purpose of it was probably like this choice. Now everybody talking about taking touch.
Yeah. Well, we did, not dispersion specifically, but we considered the question of how, what parts of the supply chain we wanted to focus on onshoring. And we ultimately made the determination that raw inputs, critical minerals, was too far upstream, that the government should focus on it, but for the CHIPS program, it was kind of too much of a bank shot. So we focused on, for example, the wafers that go into a fab. So like a TSMC fab, the core input is a 300 millimeter wafer. It looks like a big CD. those are now made at scale in Texas, a company called Global Wafers. There are only a few companies in the world that can do that. They're building a $10 billion facility down in Texas. Then upstream of the wafer is the raw polysilicon, which needs to be purified into ultra-pure polysilicon. That's now being built out in Michigan. So those are those kind of direct inputs into the supply chain, but we didn't go so far as rare earths and critical minerals. The current administration, though, is looking at using some of the leftover CHIPS funds for that purpose, which I think I don't have a strong view on it one way or the other.
Is lesson one an acknowledgement that there was something to the everything bagel criticism, or what did Klein get right?
Yeah, I think the overall point that you need to have a North Star and keep that North Star central is right. I think what it got wrong was that we had actually set up a construct and a kind of evaluation system that was going to allow us to do that. And that was, I think, really important for our success. And that really the important thing is not, looking at every little bit of an application. I think it's totally appropriate for the government to say, in the context of giving a bunch of money out, yeah, we want to know what your workforce plan is, or we want to know what the environmental impact's going to be, and that's going to be part of a holistic review. What really creates problems is when you create veto points that you can't control, right? That is where you really run into, the kind of paralysis of the state's capacity to do big things.
Yeah, basically to us, there was some progress and was transference in Jack, where that is proceeded as they gone for the people that is our asked, then there was some that in the system as realization that from track or one as only to show some that's correction. It like for some modern use of environment when inspired surprise at the part. Yeah, I choose special to check for that. Plus, there are guys that work price and didn't. Yeah, I might this a lot with this mark support and the site of large Chinese calls height and largely irons. There's the guy but sports and bottom. They make you use that for all this. I had minions what so yeah, and so I did brought debates in for when the stuff higher crash and she can buy this about.
Yeah, I think in the context of making any particular intervention, the policymaker needs to think through the potential impact. So I have no concern, none, that CHIPS grants are going to lead to companies being less competitive, relying on the state, et cetera. These companies are engaged in ruthless, cutthroat competition, and they're in a concentrated industry. Those who want to be here are relying on grants to help make it happen. But I do have greater concerns in the context, for example, of like the MP Materials deal I talked about, where that might be a necessary thing for the government to do right now, given that these rare earth magnets have been exposed to such a vulnerability. But a world in which you're doing guaranteed offtake for a single company at a certain price is actually not a world in which you're creating a lot of space for competition and innovation in an industry that's not very mature right now. And so I think it just has to be evaluated on the level of the intervention, and I think needs to be taken those concerns need to be taken very seriously.
Yeah, our last question, I wanted to ask you about the understanding of the design in the CHIPS, which is that is the ability for the firms to get money through the CHIPS Act that they base on, and we keep like that. Is that, and we point out that there's a way to kind of be established. But does that really depend on how much they create jobs or how much investment they bring in, and how well that is actually done?
Yeah, it's not jobs, but it's about investment, and it's about progress in building out the projects they committed to build. So it will be, let's say they've committed to build a fab. You could have one milestone that's when they finish the clean room, another milestone that is when they start installing equipment, another milestone for their first production wafer, and another milestone when their fab reaches 80% utilization. Right? And that way the government is kind of protected over time. And then on the back end of it is a clawback that says if you don't finish the project or you abandon the project, we get the money back as well. Yes. Yeah, no, that was like a huge part of the negotiations we had was in the weeds of these milestones. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think we have to leave it there, but thank you for a really
Thank you.
wonderful